They tried strategy, the human kind. The kind laced in deceit, dipped in ego, wrapped in false alliances. They built traps like architects who had studied your past missteps as if they were blueprints. And yet, you didn't trip. You didn't stumble. You didn't fall apart in the way they planned. You moved through every snare with eerie precision. Not because you were always stronger, but because you were aligned with something they couldn't account for. Something outside of their equations. They tried everything human: manipulation, rumor, betrayal with a handshake. But they didn't know they were fighting against more than your endurance. They were fighting against a force that does not explain itself. Something divine was on your side, and the irony is, they never saw it until it was too late. They attacked your mind first. That's the human default. If they can't ruin your reputation, they try to corrupt your perception of self, gaslight you, sow confusion, turn every mirror into a weapon. But when you responded with clarity instead of chaos, with grace instead of retaliation, it disturbed them. Your resilience wasn't reactive. It was rooted. It was unnerving. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It becomes a presence. And the more they tried to destabilize you, the more they became unglued. Your calm made them panic. Your silence made them paranoid. They started to see shadows of themselves in your restraint. That's the thing about divine backing, it reflects. And reflection terrifies those who only feel powerful when no one's watching. They thought they could disassemble you piece by piece, emotionally, socially, spiritually. But their methods were too mortal. You weren't playing by their rules. You weren't even in their arena. While they played chess with lies and sabotage, you were guided by something older than strategy. You didn't need to plot. You listened. You didn't need to predict. You knew. And that knowing, that stillness, it made everything they did feel loud, desperate, flailing. The more calculated they became, the more divine your detachment appeared. You weren't absent. You were elevated, and the altitude made their efforts look embarrassing. Your intuition made their intellect feel small. They didn't expect the storm to have a pulse. But you weren't just the calm. You were the eye. They tried envy. Human envy is acidic. It pretends to admire while secretly planning your erosion. They smiled at you, waiting for you to hand them access. But divine forces don't just protect, they obscure. You became a riddle to those who thought you were a routine. They tried to trace your rise, copy your tone, imitate your essence. But divinity doesn't replicate. It repels imposters. And while they were busy trying to decode you, they missed the most obvious truth: you weren't winning because of what you knew. You were winning because of what you served. You were aligned. You were chosen. Not in a grandiose, fantasy sense, but in the way that integrity selects its vessels and truth protects its carriers. You didn't have to defend yourself. Something unseen did it for you. They assumed you'd need them. That's the most human illusion. To believe power comes from proximity. But when you detached and nothing collapsed, when you disconnected and only grew sharper, it frightened them. You were supposed to diminish without their validation, but you became more refined, more precise. As if the distance purified you, and it did. Because human weapons can't penetrate souls shielded by purpose. They threw stones at your character, and the divine turned them into stepping stones. They tried to bury you in their gossip, and the divine used it as compost for your evolution. You didn't fight to survive. You listened, and followed the whisper that pulled you forward while they screamed in circles. They tried exploitation, extracting from your kindness, milking your silence, turning your generosity into weakness. But what they forgot is that the divine doesn't just back the kind. It watches who tries to take advantage of them. Every attempt they made to drain you was logged. Every selfish interaction they disguised as support was marked. And the divine didn't just protect you. It prepared receipts. You didn't retaliate. You just glowed differently. You started attracting people who spoke in truth, not transaction. And they noticed. That glow they once mocked. Now it burns their eyes, because you were built by something they don't pray to. You were refined by a heat they can't endure. They tried fear, subtle threats, emotional withdrawal, strategic abandonment, hoping your fear of loneliness would make you pliable. But you didn't shatter. You didn't chase. You transformed solitude into sanctuary, and that destroyed them. Because people who rely on control don't understand those who've made peace with themselves. You weren't alone. You were accompanied. Every night they thought you cried yourself to sleep, you were being rewired in silence. And when you re-emerged, they didn't recognize you. Because the divine doesn't bring you back the same. It brings you back bulletproof. With discernment so sharp, their old tricks start bleeding on arrival. You don't fear loss anymore. You learned that anything you lose when aligned with divinity was never yours. It was clutter disguised as connection. They tried groupthink, the human mob, whisper networks, character assassinations dressed as concern. Because when individuals fail to destroy you, they gather numbers. They thought collective slander would overwhelm your presence. But the divine doesn't require popularity. It thrives in truth. You didn't defend yourself in every room. You didn't argue every false narrative. You stood still. And in that stillness, the lies began to collapse under their own contradictions. The divine reversed the algorithm. You didn't need to scream your truth. It began speaking through others. People started to feel uncomfortable defending your enemies. Your name began to feel holy in rooms filled with rumor. That's the divine. It flips the current, not by force, but by being undeniable. They tried logic, that cold human version. They wanted you to fold under the weight of facts twisted for convenience. They quoted your mistakes without context. They painted your complexity as contradiction. But the divine made your growth magnetic. It made your evolution feel like prophecy. And now, every version of you they used to mock feels like a relic of their own ignorance. You didn't need to be understood. You needed to become unmissable. And you did, because people may doubt your words. But they feel your frequency. And when it's real, when it's divine, it bypasses intellect and strikes the soul. Now they sit in silence, wondering how you kept winning without scheming, how you rose without revenge, how you knew without being told. They tried everything human: pride, deceit, seduction, exile, and you walked through it like a sermon dressed in flesh. They forgot that there are some people you can't break because they've already been claimed. And now they're watching you ascend without reacting, without apologizing, without needing closure. You don't fear them. You don't hate them. You simply outgrew them. And the silence between you now, that's not avoidance. That's the divine drawing the line. Let them keep trying. Let them circle. Let them theorize. You are no longer within reach, because what backs you now has no name, no face, no weakness, just purpose. And that kind of backing makes you not just dangerous, but destined. They moved like puppeteers, thinking you were just another marionette dangling by strings of insecurity. They plotted in corners they assumed you couldn't see, whispered in shadows they thought would never touch your ears. They crafted stories, narratives stitched with lies so clean, even the truth started to look guilty. They didn't need to scream to ruin you. They used suggestion, subtle innuendo, quiet implication, the art of passive destruction. And yet, you walked through their maze of manipulation untouched. They couldn't understand it, because their tactics were designed to crush the average soul. But you weren't average. Their fire didn't melt you, it refined you. They mistook your silence for naivety, not realizing they were trying to dismantle something reinforced by forces older than language. You weren't just resilient, you were armored by something eternal. They twisted logic like vines, trying to choke the clarity out of every conversation. They'd flip the context, reframe the question, create confusion, then watch to see if you'd drown in it. Because once you start doubting your own senses, your power slips. That's how they play the long game. Confusion as a weapon, but you didn't drown. You smiled. You let them talk. Let them build the lie. Let them inflate their delusion. Because you already saw the ending. You weren't interested in winning the argument. You were sculpting legacy while they were drafting petty scripts. They underestimated the strength of someone who doesn't need to prove a point. You let them believe they had control, knowing full well you were standing on ground they'd never access. A spiritual elevation they couldn't fabricate, mimic, or manipulate. Your stillness wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Your restraint wasn't fear. It was design. They used every human tool available: deception, guilt, social triangulation, the psychological guerrilla warfare that breaks most people in silence. But you were backed by something else, something that doesn't show up in texts or recordings, something that makes people's stomachs turn when they stand near you too long. An ancient stillness, a soul that's been here before. You didn't respond the way they expected because you weren't reacting from this lifetime alone. You didn't fight like someone defending territory. You fought like someone who already owns the land beneath the illusion, and that's what terrified them. Not just that you didn't fall, but that you never even shook. Every trap they laid, every social chess move they rehearsed, failed to account for the fact that you weren't playing their game. You were something they didn't believe existed untouchable. And when none of it worked, when the rumors fell flat, when the slander lost its sting, when the tension they hoped would break you only shaped your poise, they began to unravel. Not because you struck back. You didn't need to. But because their entire strategy depended on your emotional collapse, and you refused. Your peace became an accusation, your silence a mirror. They kept speaking your name, and it echoed in rooms differently each time. No matter how much they edited the story, people started noticing the cracks, because lies can only run so far before they grow tired. And truth, it doesn't need to chase. It waits, patient, eternal, just like you. There's something unnerving about someone who doesn't seek justice, because that usually means they've already received it. Quietly, spiritually, psychologically. You never asked the crowd to choose sides. You never defended yourself at the podium of pity. And yet, one by one, people started waking up. Not because you proved anything, but because you embodied everything they tried to hide. You became the consequence without raising your voice. And that's the kind of power they'll never understand. Because power, real power, doesn't move loudly. It hums beneath the surface. It waits in the marrow of the ones who have died before, emotionally, socially, spiritually, and come back colder, cleaner, wiser. They plotted your ruin, but their logic was flawed. You weren't held together by ego. You were built from soul. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted you to scream, to react, to get messy enough that they could point and say, "See, that's who they are." But you didn't. You just watched. The way ancient trees watch the storms. The way wolves study sheep in masquerade. And when the storm passed, they realized they didn't shake you. They revealed you. They painted you in shadow, hoping no one would notice your glow was internal, that your resilience wasn't performative. It was engineered, forged in every betrayal that came before. Your soul wore armor they couldn't crack, not because it was impenetrable, but because they were never worthy of accessing it in the first place. Their tactics failed because they were rooted in the human condition: ego, fear, manipulation. But you were fueled by something timeless, something that doesn't need witnesses to validate its strength. They mistook your delay for weakness, not realizing divine timing moves differently. You didn't clap back. You ascended. You didn't retaliate. You redefined. And in doing so, you made every insult irrelevant, every rumor obsolete. They thought you would burn, but your ashes became blueprints. They thought they were closing a chapter, but they were just sharpening your pen. Now, they don't know how to undo what you became in their absence. You were never trying to defeat them. You were never competing. That's what they couldn't compute. Your game wasn't survival, it was transcendence. While they schemed in the flesh, you meditated in the spirit. While they calculated revenge, you aligned with restoration. That's what rattles them now. That everything they did with the intention to break you only pushed you further into becoming the version of yourself they feared most: unshakable, unreadable, and no longer available. You outgrew their weapons, and when you do that, you become dangerous in a way that's hard to describe. Not loud, not violent, just untouchable. You didn't fight like them because your weapons were invisible, but undeniable. They came at you with volume, with theatrics, with alliances stitched from shallow insecurities, and whispered half-truths. They craved war in the open, where eyes watched and ears absorbed. They wanted smoke. You gave them silence. They wanted spectacle. You gave them solitude. And that is what unhinged them the most. Your refusal to meet them on their battleground. You declined the invitation to chaos not because you lacked strength, but because your arsenal was more refined, more ancient, more patient. While they flailed for dominance through performance, you studied the fabric of the room. You observed patterns, logged betrayals, memorized tones, traced the shadows in every sentence. They fought for attention. You moved with intention. They never realized you were building something beneath the surface while they were setting fires above it. And now, those fires burn out. But what you planted in silence, it blooms with vengeance wrapped in elegance. Your weapons weren't forged in rage, but in clarity. They were laced in conviction, in stillness, in presence that didn't need an audience to validate its sharpness. You didn't insult. You observed. You didn't retaliate. You recalibrated. You wielded timing like a blade. You understood that some battles are won not by counterattacks, but by detachment. That's what they couldn't grasp. They wanted noise. You gave them calculation. You let them believe they were winning. You allowed them their victory laps around a battlefield you never stepped on. And while they were distracted with conquest, you redefined the terrain. By the time they realized the war was never yours to begin with, they were already choking on the dust of your distance. That's the thing about invisible weapons. They don't just cut. They humiliate, because no one can defend against something they can't name. And now, they speak your name like a warning, not a memory. They underestimated the power of unseen warfare, spiritual discipline, mental detachment, emotional silence. To them, power looked like dominance, raised voices, public put-downs, dramatic exits. They fed off chaos, believing the louder one wins. You, however, knew better. You understood the elegance of unseen execution. You let them sabotage themselves, while you became a ghost in plain sight, felt, not seen. You didn't announce your moves. You didn't explain your steps. You allowed presence to speak louder than explanation. And while they performed for the crowd, you rewired the entire stage. Now, they look back at moments where you said nothing, and they hear everything. Every glance you gave now replays in their heads like encrypted messages. Every pause, every withheld reply, it wasn't avoidance. It was warfare, and they lost badly. Because they never knew where the strikes were coming from. They just knew that suddenly everything about them felt exposed. You were surgical while they were sloppy. They came at you with blunt force, hoping to scare you into a reaction. You offered no reaction, only observation. And in that stillness, your strength whispered. That whisper was enough to turn their armies against themselves. You weaponized patience. You turned time into a scalpel. While they celebrated premature victories, you studied the cracks. You let them dig deeper into their delusions. You allowed them the illusion of power. And when you finally moved, it wasn't loud. It was precise, irrefutable, irreversible. You didn't need a sword when your shadow was sharper. And now they sit in the aftermath, unsure how they lost a war they swore they'd already won. That confusion, that's your legacy. Because your weapons weren't just invisible, they were inevitable. They never saw the war you were really fighting. It wasn't about them. It was within. You were breaking cycles, unlearning conditioning, slicing off your need for validation with surgical precision. That kind of inner war, it's not loud. It doesn't wear medals, but it leaves you forged. And once you were forged, you no longer needed revenge. You became the consequence. They expected retaliation and were met with irrelevance. That stung more than any insult ever could. You became unshakable, not because you won the argument, but because you stopped needing to participate. Your strength no longer required witnesses, and your absence became your battlefield. You walked away, and the ground cracked beneath them, because they built their identity on your reaction. And now that you've denied them that, they're falling apart, trying to fight ghosts. You understood that real dominance doesn't need to be proven. It's implied. It's the way you show up without seeking control, yet control shifts toward you. It's the way people lean forward when you speak, even if you're saying nothing at all. You built that power silently, and now it speaks in every room you enter. They tried to bait you into combat. Petty arguments, lies disguised as questions, validation traps wrapped in flattery. You smiled. You declined. You didn't rise to the bait. You erased the hook. And they're still waiting for the blow that never came. Because your strike wasn't external. It was existential. It left them questioning their own worth without you ever saying a word. That's the kind of weapon that leaves no fingerprints but writes history. You didn't fight for dominance. You mastered alignment. You calibrated your soul so sharply that no attack could land. That's what made you dangerous. Not just your ability to endure, but your refusal to be moved off center. They threw confusion at you, hoping to tangle your clarity, but you responded with detachment. They offered chaos, you offered emptiness. And that emptiness echoed louder than any scream. Because in that silence, they saw themselves. Without the noise to distract them, their mask slipped. And you watched, not with joy, but with finality. You had already left. Not physically, but energetically. You no longer lived in their narrative. And that exile was your sharpest weapon. Because you proved that the most violent revolution is peace. Invisible warfare is the most terrifying because there's nothing to aim at, no event to blame, no incident to replay, just a series of subtle realizations that you are no longer accessible, that you no longer need to be understood, that your absence is louder than their presence. You didn't post your growth. You didn't document your healing. You embodied it. And now, they're left with screenshots of who you used to be, while you've become someone they don't even have the vocabulary to define. You didn't argue your worth. You became it. And the ones who once weaponized your empathy now find themselves cut by your absence. Because you were never a participant in their power play. You were the quiet architect dismantling the entire board. You built a life where their name no longer echoed. You created momentum they can't intercept. You became an ecosystem that doesn't require their air. And that's why they're suffocating. Not because you attacked them, but because you no longer breathe with them. You no longer explain, apologize, or shrink. You let your growth suffocate their illusion. And that slow burn, that's the real warfare. No explosion, no climax, just distance, and the haunting realization that they lost you to a fight you never confirmed was happening. Your weapons were invisible, but the wreckage, it speaks volumes. They mistook your calm for compliance, your stillness for softness, your silence for surrender. They assumed that because you didn't react the way they were used to, the way they could manipulate, you must have been Narvi, maybe even weak. They couldn't see that you were sitting in an entirely different dimension of thought, a level where ego doesn't drive action, where validation isn't a currency, where reaction is reserved only for what deserves energy. They brought chaos to your doorstep like it was a test. What they didn't realize was that you'd already passed it. Years ago, you weren't born at this frequency. You earned blood, through fire, through brutal rebirths that reshaped your soul. They tried you because they couldn't see the shields in your eyes. Shields built from nights where you met your demons and shook hands with them. They were used to scaring people with volume, with gossip, with guilt, with games. But none of it landed on you, and it drove them mad. Because their usual tools didn't dent your armor, and when those tools failed, they panicked. That's when it started to dawn on them. Maybe you weren't playing the same game. Maybe you were never meant to be controlled, only tested. And the moment they tested you, they realized they were kneeling in the presence of someone who had buried versions of themselves they wouldn't survive meeting.